writing from Reverend Teresa Soto, a colleague in Unitarian Universalism. It's called Spilling the Light. She writes, "Some people are used to keeping rules. Don't cross the street when the light is red, only sensible. It turns out that keeping rules isn't the same as keeping covenant, which asks us, instead of keeping a bright line, to keep our promises. And to what have we promised ourselves? To this moment in time and place, to this community, and even tenderly interconnected to this planet. We promise ourselves to the idea that we are each and all human beings. We promise that there is something moving between us that we cannot tame and cannot measure. The chalice is a reminder that what flame we keep inside us cannot light the way. The light must spill to shine. The thing you must be is yourself, unadulterated, shedding the willingness to journey alone as though you are made of something hard and unforgivable. You are human. You belong right here, right now. And together we will chase away the sickness, the secrets, and leave only the open possibility that the future is a space for growth. May it be so."
The chalice will now be lit in the sanctuary. If you have your own chalice, please light it now too.
Oh, thank you so much. So the phrase, flatten the curve, is one we all know. 3 words reflect an epic change in the world and most of our individual lives. Between the horizon, the horizontal, and this vertical axis, a line begins to move. And we'll remember numbness and denial. We'll remember a sense of distant unease, wondering how they are across the ocean, and being grateful for the size of that ocean, right? And then suddenly the line jumps up. Horrifyingly, it represents contamination, hospitalization, and death. And for some of us, it's extraordinarily personal. The line shifts course, becoming unbelievably steep, up in massive waves of disease, shock waves of blame. And unless you're trained for emergencies, for those who believe the line, comes waves of fear and anxiety and instincts to protect, hoard supplies, and hunker down in place. We watch the line that describes unimaginable losses and hear that phrase, flatten the curve. But it's not a curve yet. It's still climbing. We'll remember. But the science tells us what we can do. One person, one household, and critically each government at every level has received recommendations for what we can do to see the line stop climbing and begin to bend and then flatten. We hear what it will take to begin the decline to fewer hospitalizations, fewer deaths. We hear that trying to save lives will come at a cost, many costs, and dramatic, difficult changes in our lives. But we do it. Those of us who do what science has told us to do, then see others who refuse. Our sense of urgency and fear peak into anger and even, I confess, hatred of them because they oppose my righteous fervor, our righteous desire to flatten the curve. And science writer and organizational consultant Margaret Wheatley writes about urgency in her book, Perseverance. She says, we hastily judge them as being in denial or just looking for an excuse not to get involved. Captured by a sense of urgency, she continues, we create categories, those for and against us, those who get it, those who don't. Enemies proliferate. Stop, she writes. Urgency leads nowhere except into the wilderness of aggression and failure. It doesn't serve our cause. Now I have a problem. We'll return to that curve that is not yet a curve, but this thing about urgency and enemies is a problem for me. You see, my work for my day job, I work with a team of volunteers to support our congregations and communities to address climate change. We climate organizers get overwhelmed with a sense of urgency because we see the science and the climbing lines and record levels of extreme weather, famine, fires, drought, cancers, lung disorders, species extinction. We get overwhelmed with a sense of urgency. And in response to that urgency, I think we see people shutting down, denying the information, or at least not responding. And our sense of urgency increases. In fact, the Green Sanctuary team and I are right now about to roll out a program called Climate Urgency. We want to use whatever reputation the program has among us to make and wake a sense of urgency and then provide guidance for what can be done. In that line, in that curve, I suddenly saw a possibility for widespread, even global climate urgency when I witnessed, in response to that curve, local and state governments begin to respond decisively to flatten it. Hope flashed in me. Yes, I thought, here we are, experiencing with the pandemic what I hope we can learn to do in order to bend and flatten the curve of growing climate-related catastrophes. Hope flashes. And then I hear again the words about those who do not change their lives to meet the terrible need I see. Margaret Wheatley again. I hastily judge them as being in denial or just looking for an excuse not to get involved. She continues, we are captured by a sense of urgency. We then create categories, those for and against us, those who get it, those who don't. Enemies proliferate. Stop. Urgency leads nowhere except into the wilderness of aggression and failure. It doesn't serve our cause. A paradox, I think. The need for immediate response is clear with COVID-19. Those who can shelter in place step out of the way of people skilled to deal with urgent needs, out of the way of those required to leave safety as their work is essential to the good of the whole. The workers, the frontline folks respond with urgency. The rest of us change our lives if we can. The paradox, I think, is that urgency is critical for the trained frontliners. And urgency, when unfocused on immediate strategic action, will create enemies. or that urgency will intensify enemy lines already drawn in the sand, deeply, deeply dividing political and religious systems, deeply dividing by each side, always believing that we are right. Deeply divided by training and tradition, and it turns out by evolution to divine purpose, either as exploring and being open in mind and heart, or protecting and maintaining tradition and order. You might recognize this as a necessary polarity. But we have become deeply divided by a righteous sense of purity. How dare you disrespect the flag, for instance, versus how dare you protect a symbol of something that is unjust. When we pit ourselves in this way, right and wrong, we will not collaborate. And we must collaborate if we are to flatten the curve of the pandemic, this pandemic and those pandemics to come. We must learn to collaborate across these dug-in polar opposites in order to curve and flatten the spiking lines of pandemic and climate crisis. Jonathan Haidt has much to teach us about polarized moralities and righteousness. He's a researcher you can find on TED Talks. I can't do him justice here except to say that he encourages us to keep working for our just causes, but do what we can, all that we can, to realize everyone thinks they're right. And in fact, that evolution itself has created the human mind to develop morality in opposite ways, that when we learn how, we'll see can move us in more balance, like yin and yang. We have much learning to do on this score. And so I breathe, we temper our sense of urgency with listening to those who seem to resist. See if we can find the core of values we might recognize and also value ourselves. And then we go to work together wherever we can. And then we lift memory. We lift the stories as they take shape in us right now. For me, there is now a memory in my gut, actually in my body, a first memory of panic, seeing the terrible spike that indicates pandemic contamination and indicates weather extremes on the world graph. The terrible spikes in COVID-19 hospitalizations and deaths, and the already massive spikes in climate deaths related to famine, to fire and drought, to flood, lung disease, asthma, cancer, and species extinction. The extremity of climate illness, loss, and death fills me with dread, much the same way as COVID first did. You may see another similarity. Facts about death alone, then piling on more facts and graphs about crisis, does not necessarily mobilize most of us into positive action, unless we're trained for immediate response to emergency. We know what to do. Rather, most of us stop dead in our tracks, or run to safety, or deny, or shut down, or stop listening to the facts. It's just too much. What I'm learning from this pandemic, I hope will transfer to climate change. That is, in order to flatten the curve, leadership is necessary at every level, every household, every school, every church, synagogue, and temple, every shop, every corporation, as well as every level of government. Leadership has to share good information, critical information about safety and who among us is in need. Then we organize ourselves at every level to extend our care, to protect as best we can the most vulnerable. Along with leadership for clear action, there must be millions, literally millions of ways for each person to share their gifts. We see it as we flatten the curve of the pandemic. Here is the good news. Every artist, musician, every poet and preacher is needed to keep inspiring us, keep us going, and keep us connected to our deepest reserves. Every family and congregation must connect in all the ways available to safely connect in order that our vision of what we hope for will survive. And together we honor love and compassion, and to co-create beauty and joy, and to hold one another in our grief until there's a time when we can come together in person and hold one another in our grief. Every person skillful in compassion and emotional depth is necessary to help us develop emotional, spiritual resilience and depth. We've got to practice using muscles of listening, not reacting, but listening and learning. Heck, in preparation for this service, I needed to remember not to make enemies of the people whose behavior I fear. While we do our part to protect and share and rebuild, we've got to learn what it takes not to polarize our world into right and wrong as we work for beloved community, because that's our task. Our task, I think, as people of faith, in this particular faith, we have resources and I believe the responsibility to plumb the depths and practice, if we would, do it more often. We have covenant that changes with new experience and views. We're learning how to compassionately hold each other accountable to those covenants. We hold vision for a world made fair and the people living as one. That's more than a reading in the back of the hymnal, much more than a slogan. It's got to be deep practice. We all have to work at it. And you know what? The glorious truth is that while it is very hard work, practicing beloved community can bring with it a deep sense of meaning, a resonance of connection and recognition. It can bring laughter, lots of laughter, and it can bring humility and love. There are so many good reasons to build for this new way of being in community. So we need leadership at every level. We need to honor each other's tasks, their own, our own, your own authentic way as part of what is critical to become whole in community. Every community needs leadership to remind us of our intentions and to share information. In this pandemic, we needed to learn that masks are critical. And then, of course, thousands and thousands of people, many of you here, and companies are making masks and giving them away or selling them at cost. So it also goes with food and other resources that are scarce for far too many communities and available in abundance elsewhere. We are practicing through the pandemic mutual aid. Sharing what is needed has become a thing, a value. Please, don't go back to normal. Please, let's maintain this beautiful instinct, this ancient way of taking care of one another. We are learning to see with more clarity our terrible failures as a society to care for those living in institutions, from nursing homes to prisons, and those for whom shelter in place is far from safe. Dangerously overcrowded, exposed to toxic air, bad water, poisonous environments. Shelter in place is violent for far too many. Isolated in addiction, domestic violence, child abuse, escalating government-sanctioned violence is rampant in the world. And here, when the public's eyes and hearts are drawn to crisis, it increases. Let's not go back to normal. We must not quarantine our minds again, hiding from what we know about the many thousands and millions of people for whom business as usual is miserable or fatal. Along with mutual aid, communities of color in particular are providing leadership to practice protection and advocacy for those most vulnerable. That is more good news because it helps us not be overwhelmed by the facts and that graph, that spike. It helps us understand there is much that we can do. More and more communities that have lived quite separately are beginning to intersect. Some of those accustomed to having access to power and resources are learning, not fast enough, but we are learning to let go of some of that power in favor of supporting the brilliant, the generative, often the young leadership that blooms in marginalized communities. And many leaders and members of marginalized communities are stretching, learning to trust, leaning towards those they may have little reason to trust in order to teach, to share, and to recruit collaboration. It's a beautiful thing. Let's not go back to normal segregation. Let's not return to deeply separated communities. It's always better to get to know each other before the crisis. But in this crisis, if we are stretching beyond comfort to learn with one another across boundaries, then let's keep it going. There are so many ways it would be better not to return to normal. As our leadership releases restrictions, it will be tempting to return to as much normalcy as possible. We'll fly there if we can. But before that happens, think, please, about our deepest values. Think then about how your life and our collective life has changed, and whether there are things we can refuse to return to in favor of growing the more generative, life-affirming practices we have found. And we've had the privilege to have them. How can our behaviors mitigate dangerous trends? How can we remind our governments at every level, from local to national, international, to return only to that which is generative and challenge a return to normal inequities and violence? How can we continue mutual aid? How can we continue to support frontline leadership to organize for systematic change? How can we help support positive change for the most vulnerable, including those dependent on institutions for their care? Now, as we think about these things, imagine what is possible as we talk about rebuilding the pandemic. And know that these are exactly the ways in which we can impact climate chaos, to mitigate the impact of climate change, to build all kinds of resilience in communities and between communities for the changes that will come, that are here. These are the ways that we are learning in pandemic that can actually impact climate chaos, to protect the most vulnerable, to build active hope and muscular love. These will flatten the curve, build anew from the pandemic, and flatten the curve and build anew from climate disaster as we face it in community. We all have a role. We have to work at not going back to sleep, or not distancing ourselves so much from the facts that we are able to go back to sleep. Do not make enemies, but find connection and recruit one another into vision. Create vision with others. Build possibilities using your unique skills and gifts. It will be so good to return to normal ways of connecting with friends, of supporting one another in our grief, being with family, being with our coworkers and our collaborators. It will be a relief to feel more ground under our feet, but do not look solely for familial ground. For instance, relying only on a nest egg for your family or for yourself, you might think differently of mutual aid for communities to share. And on it goes. Thousands and thousands of ways to flatten the curve and rebuild the world. But only if we ground that work in our core values, in our love of life, in a personal and institutional resilience built on collaboration, on community and care. This is who we are, folks. This is who we say we want to be. I realize I hold a gift in me of hundreds of stories of resilience and collaborative communities. And I wanted to share them all with you today to buffer us against what I was doing, dear source of life. What was I thinking of talking about COVID-19 and climate crisis at the same time? The truth is that you and I have stories we are now living. We see stories unfolding as we speak, and it is possible to train our view, our collective viewing and seeing, to find the stories, looking into neighborhoods, listening to frontline leaders in every region of every continent. Those stories sustain me through depression and doubt. They can sustain you too. I want the gifts of stories for you because the possibilities, the vision, and the life-sustaining practices exist everywhere. We as a people together know how to create life in a way that is better for all, including the earth and its beings with whom we must share everything. We need only stay awake, use what we are learning now, grounded in our most sustaining values and our deepest connections to the sacred. Oh, may that be so for each of our households, for our neighborhoods, for our congregations, and our communities. May it be so for us all. Blessed be. Amen. And in closing, I share words from Adrienne Rich. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. I'm not sure I was unmuted. Here I am. I want to share Adrienne Rich's words. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who age after age perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world. And the final hymn, if you would join your hearts and reconstitute the world with Lean on Me.